one. I encourage you to go inside so that you can see the full exhibit. It's a story of transportation for Aransas County. So you'll see artifacts and posters and maps and audio visuals that are highlighting the sailing ships, the wagons, the trains, the cars, and the airplanes that move people through Aransas County. So today, I want to remind you that we'll have programs every other Sunday, basically at 2 p.m. Some of those may be Zoom if the speakers choose not to come into town. If they're not on Zoom, you need a reservation to come into the History Center. And I've got postcards that have the schedule for all those programs on it. I hope you'll take some of those. I hope you'll take postcards to remind your friends to come. Because we know it's going to take a lot of publicity to encourage people to come out. Also, think about the fact that we're open on Mondays and Fridays from 10 to 2. So for people who do not want to come, when there might be a lot of people in here, they could come on Mondays or Fridays from 10 to 2. So we're open all that time. We have a few board members here today. Some of them are off doing different duties in the House, for example. But we've got Ron Melvin over here behind the camera. Let's see, Maureen Winkleman out here, and Mel Karnarek over in the shade. Okay, so all those folks are here. Dave Krotsky will be here tomorrow, and Leah Olivia, who's been with us for a long time, is functioning long distance at this particular time. I'd like to thank the people who have funded, in part, this exhibit. The Coastal Bend Community Foundation, Castaways, Thrift Shop, and the Marguerite Sowers Foundation. They all contributed to our exhibit schedule for the year, so we really, really appreciate that. Today, as many of you have met him, but today we're in for a real treat. I first met Ken at a symposium 2 or 3 years ago when we had a symposium on railroads here in Rockport, and he gave a talk about his Eagle Lake Depot. And at the time we just visited, and then when we decided to do this exhibit, I started contacting him about coming down. So he's been here with us for a couple of days, helped training the docents, and he's going to talk this morning. He lists himself as the station agent for the restored SAP depot in Eagle Lake. In real life, he works for Cisco. So if you'll join me in welcoming his talk, How Railroads Changed Texas. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much, Pam, and thank you, everybody. Thank you to the History Center for having me today. I appreciate this opportunity to help kick off this exhibit. I promise, because we're outside, even though the weather is kind of unusually beautiful for this time of year, I'm not going to keep you too long. I really want to talk just briefly about how the railroads changed Texas and kind of how they changed our lives. Not long after Texas gained its independence in 1836, a charter was issued for the Texas Railroad Navigation and Banking Company. When you merge all those together, you know, people were okay with transportation and navigation, but they became very suspicious of the banking portion, and especially the fact that there were so many monopoly elements in that charter. So even though there was a lot of politics around there, a lot of promotion, there was a lot of resistance, and within 2 years, that organization failed to exist. There were several other ventures, but the most significant was about 5 years later in 1841 when the Harrisburg Railroad and Trading Company was chartered, because it actually completed 2 miles of grading. But they found out that after that they didn't have the money to buy the rails that were necessary and the ties to actually put some ties down, but no money to buy rails. So that pretty much died on the vine as well when they couldn't complete the project. But at least they had actually shoveled some dirt, as we say. Finally, February 11th, 1850, the Buffalo Bayou Brazos, Colorado was chartered, and it actually built 20 miles from Harrisburg, you know, south of Houston, to Stafford's Point by September the 7th of 1853. It was the first railroad to operate in Texas, and it was only the second west of the Mississippi River. And so that's where I'm going to kind of leave the actual history, because we pretty much go on gangbusters from there. By the time of the Civil War, there's 7, 8, or 9 railroads actually operating in Texas. But to get to the point of how they changed our lives, for example, in 1854, the 35-mile trip by stagecoach from Houston to Hockley took a day and a half and included an overnight stop. 3 years later, it only took an hour and 40 minutes by rail. And the railroad freight rates were about half of those charged by the teamsters, and cotton farmers began to use the railroads to ship their product out to market. So it really changed the way that we lived and the way we even farmed and shipped goods to market. Now, the early railroads in Texas typically developed near the coast or an inland waterway, because the whole idea was to kind of facilitate transportation, not just be an island in and of yourself. So the origins and a lot of times the endpoints of those lines boomed with growth. For example, San Antonio was the last major city in the United States to get railroad service. They didn't get it until 1877. They were so far inland and so far away from a seaport, they became more and more isolated, and the city fathers worked feverishly all through the 1870s to get a railroad, and by the time they got one. So when they got the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio in 1877, by 3 years later when the next census was compiled, their population went from 16,000 to almost twice that, about 31,000. And of course you had all sorts of hotels, restaurants, all things that facilitate business. You had streetcars and everything that started to formulate. So the railroads were really kind of the impetus for a lot of growth there. So the worst thing that could happen to a town in Texas to be bypassed by the railroad by only maybe 5 or 10 miles. A couple examples, in Lee County there's two towns, Old Dime Box and Dime Box. Well, Old Dime Box, was never a huge and thriving metropolis, but it was around for a while. Well, in 1913, the Southern Pacific Railroad bypassed them by only 3 miles. That was close enough to where a lot of people just decided they were going to pick up and move, and so they established the town of Dime Box on the railroad, and the existing one became Old Dime Box and sort of withered. Still survives today, but kind of a fragment of itself. A much larger example was Helena, which is on the east side of the San Antonio River. For many years, it was the most important city between San Antonio and Goliad, and it was on the La Bahia Road, so they captured a lot of the trade. In 1854, it was the seat of the newly formed Karnes County. In 1885, the citizens of that town refused to raise money and pay a bonus to the San Antonio and Aransas Pass, and therefore that town was bypassed by the railroad in 1886. So the town of Helena withered, and in 1894, Karnes City, which was on the railroad and had paid the bonus, became the county seat. This sort of thing was replicated all over Texas, and so the railroads changed where people lived, how they thrived, and such. With the railroads also, though, came a link to the outside world, both physically and electronically. You now had access to go to places and ship to markets that weren't open to you before. But with that became the telegraph. And outside of almost every depot was a telegraph office. The railroads used the telegraph to talk with the dispatch so they could control train traffic. But typically there was also another telegraph line, either through Western Union or Postal Telegraph, where you could handle news and send telegrams to distant relatives. So that was a big place where you could receive news from the outside world of significant events like election results, wars declared, or even assassinations. So local newspapers could often get regional and global news as fast as their big city counterparts, which was a big scoop for your local town paper. And often they would have a person outside that operator window sort of listening to the traffic and hearing what the operator might say about any traffic that came in, like, oh my gosh, President Garfield's been assassinated. And so they would get news very, very quickly and scoop some of the larger newspapers. Patrons could also send electronic messages to loved ones thousands of miles away via the Western Union or the Postal Telegraph. So they changed a lot of the lives and linked to the outside world and made a lot of your formerly remote towns seem at least connected, physically and electronically. So it's sort of like the internet of today, which makes you connected much more broadly. But we got even more broad things from the railroads, and not just in Texas, but all over the United States. One thing is our time zones. The time zones were formed by the railroads in 1883 after they had the Railroad Time Convention. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, every town had their local time. Here in Rockport, it was probably 12 noon whenever the sun was supposed to be directly overhead. That was local time. And you might go to Aransas Pass and the time differed by 20 or 30 minutes. But who really cared? Because, in a daytime you probably weren't going to make it that far, or at least not enough time to really care. But as we got more connected travel, the people that were traveling along the Transcontinental Railroad might have to change their watches 22 times for all the stops they made from coast to coast. And more importantly, and more convoluted basically, is the fact that if you went to a large terminal, say Buffalo, New York, or New York City, and where you could actually change among train lines, every train office had the local time from wherever their home office was. So imagine, I tell people today, imagine trying to go to the airport, you're trying to change from Southwest to United, and each of them has a different time based on where their home office is. That's what it was like trying to change trains before 1883. The railroads decided they were going to have the time convention, and they were going to divide the country into these 4 time zones, which we still have today: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. And local communities could do whatever they wanted. You could come along with railroad time, or you could stick with what you like, right? The government didn't actually adopt the time zones until 35 years later in 1918. So the day of November 18th, 1883 was the first day that this time zones were in effect, and it was called the Day of Two Noons, because in the far northeastern parts of the country, the local time of 12 noon had already been passed, and they actually had to set their clocks back if they were going to go on railroad time. So they had noon twice that day. And there were some cities that didn't go along, but basically what they told them is that if you want to travel by railroad or ship by the railroad, you better understand railroad time. Now I can remember seeing on that wonderful show, the Antique Show on Channel 8, right? Antiques Roadshow, a clock from somewhere in Ohio that had two faces, and the top face said local time, the bottom face said railroad time. And the state of Ohio was sort of a laggard. They didn't actually adopt some of the railroad time until, I know, at least past 1887, so about 4 years after the time convention. So we got the time zones. We did not get daylight savings time. That was purely a government invention, so you can't blame the railroads for that. What we also got from the railroads are the first, today what we call HMOs, health maintenance organizations. Railroading was a dangerous job, especially if you were anything in the service like working with rail cars. They're big, they're heavy, they move, they can crush your limbs. And so there used to be a saying that in the old days, before we had the knuckle couplers on the cars, we had the Lincoln pin, which was exceedingly dangerous to try to couple cars with, that no experienced railroad manager would hire a brakeman who had all 10 digits, because that meant he was a rookie. He'd never actually coupled on a couple cars. So he'd hire one that was maybe missing a few fingers because he'd learned how to do it properly. So HMOs were basically, you could, for pennies out of your paycheck, you had access to all the local doctors who were on the railroad plan, and if you were really sick, they could transport you to the railroad hospital. And like for the Santa Fe, it was in Temple. For the Southern Pacific, it was in Houston. For the Gulf Coast lines, it was in Kingsville. Cotton Belt had theirs in Texarkana. And so it just cost you nothing other than what you paid monthly out of your paycheck. And so it was very novel at the time. The railroads were the first to really come up with that, and it really kept their employee base satisfied. The last and probably the most prolific for all of us who drive were the color of our traffic signals. Do you think blue, yellow, and red just came out of the sky? No. Actually, we can thank our friends over in Britain for this. They did a lot of testing in the 1870s and 1880s because they found out that, well, for one thing, they were having some accidents. There was enough rail travel, they were having accidents. And number two, whatever colors they used at the time, there was enough color blindness that the engineers couldn't tell the difference. So they couldn't tell when to stop and when to go. So they did a lot of testing. And they actually originally came out with white for proceed, green for caution, and red for stop. And that worked fine, but of course, what they consider white light was basically just a candle. It wasn't the pure kind of white light we have, today from our bulbs. But it was good enough. They called that white or sometimes clear. Well, later on, for the colored lenses, you basically had a light source. You put a colored lens in front of it for your green and for your red. Well, later on, after white light became more prominent at night, they decided white wasn't good anymore really for a transportation signal, a moving signal. And so they basically moved green to proceed and established yellow for caution and red. And that was about 1900. And so those are where we got our traffic signals for today. They found that those had, even for people that were mildly colorblind, that they still could tell the difference between those enough to where they didn't have to worry about engineers. So that's what we got from the railroads. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and welcome everybody to the exhibit and say that railroads changed our world along with all forms of transportation. But I thank you and hope you will enjoy the visit. Thank you. You want to say something about Yoakum? Okay. That was actually Uriah Lott, because he was actually running it at the time. Of course, Yoakum was one of his vice president, but pretty much Lott and the guys that were raising funds for the railroad were the ones that actually asked for bonuses. You didn't have to get a bonus. You could provide right-of-way or something else, but for like the important towns, it cost money to bring the railroad through, so they really wanted that bonus money. And yes, you could refuse, and they might build through anyway if there was not a good alternate route. But in the flat parts of Texas, there were a lot of good alternate routes, and so for the case of like Helena, there was nothing real special when they had to go through there, and so they just basically bypassed it. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Ken. Really appreciate that overview. And Ken will be here next month on July 12th inside and do a more detailed story about SAP itself. Okay, not such a broad general piece. We have water over here in the cooler if you'd like to pick up water, and then the house, of course, is open for viewing the exhibit. We really appreciate your coming out today. One other thing, we have an outdoor exhibit, and we're getting signage for that, but I do have a brochure that explains all of the things that are in this outdoor exhibit over here if you'd like to look at that. So thanks again for coming. Glad to see you.